Hello, everybody. It is early September 2025. I have to admit, this has been such a dramatic year. It's hard to even imagine what will happen in mid or late September. But my guest today not only knows what's going to happen, I think, the rest of the year, but in the next 100 years. His new book, it actually came out last year in 2024. It's called Journey to 2025. He is a self-styled writer, philosopher, and technologist, Gary Bengler. He's a San Francisco-based guy, and he's joining us today on a rather hot San Francisco afternoon. Gary, congratulations on last year's book. I know it's won all sorts of awards. Let's get to 2125. You're a guy with some tech background, so you know how hard it is to imagine next year, let alone the next 100 years. Why write a book about 2125?
Okay. Well, Andrew, first, thanks for inviting me here. It's nice to be here with a fellow writer. I guess you've written like 5 books, and like me, you are not, I think, a techno optimist. I don't know, maybe we're both techno realists. And maybe that's part of an answer to your question. I wanted to talk about what is possible over the next 100 years. And this was the impetus behind this book was in part because I don't think science fiction has done as good of a job of helping the average person know what is likely to happen next. And if you go back to the classic days of science fiction, you had Bradbury and others predicting geosynchronous satellites, right? And they came about. So they were very much hard science, what will likely happen. But I think most science fiction writers have maybe given up. You have the category of science fiction and fantasy. They're making of dragons, always faster than light spaceships. And I think that's because it's very hard to predict the future. But unfortunately, science fiction does not do as good of a job of trying to realistically portray what will happen. And so this book, Journey to 2125, that's one of the reasons why I wrote it.
Is it odd that it seems to be increasingly that the people who predict the future most accurately aren't science fiction writers? Somebody like Margaret Atwood, for example, comes to mind. She was on the show a couple of years ago. She's anything but a science fiction writer. So do you think it's mainstream fiction writers, historians, ethicists who are best these days at predicting the future?
I think that those sorts of backgrounds can be helpful to predict aspects of the future, single subjects, far better than all the Silicon Valley techno optimists. I do not subscribe in this book to it's going to be great, trust us, it's all going to be fine. But I also don't subscribe to the dystopian views of the future, which seem to be so prolific. We're all going to die. Okay. I have.
Well, we will die, won't we, in the long run?
yeah.
So famously said.
Yes, but
you're not one of these Kurzweilian living forever types, are you?
Quite the opposite. We're all going to die. That problem of death is not going to be solved anytime soon. Thank you very much. So no, I don't believe that at all. I think that's just complete nonsense. But I also think that I have some hope that humanity can muddle through, deal with all of these challenges, and but part of that, looking ahead. So I'll say this: clearly, the next 100 years is going to be faster than the prior 100 years. Technology is accelerating our lives. That's just self-evident. And there's so many things to worry about, and people worry about so many different things. And I think that's a problem. So I asked myself, what are the primary challenges for humankind for this next century? And let's focus on those and actually solve those. And if we do, I think that maybe we can muddle through. So that's a meta thesis for this book, Journey to 2125.
Yeah, maybe we should think about worrying faster. The Turflers, of course, wrote their famous book about speed in the last part of the 20th century. They were very prescient. So I know you've written extensively on all the various threats to humanity, although you're not as you note, an apocalyptic thinker. You wrote an interesting piece about avoiding the apocalypse. When you sat down, Gary, to write Journey to 2125, what were the issues that you wanted to address? What are the subjects that you're worried about, but maybe a little bit slower and more coherently than others?
Okay, well, that's a great question. So let me answer that a little bit in a longer way by first describing what got me into this subject, and that was my first novel, which is Unfettered Journey, which was released in 2020 in the height of COVID, etc. That's a book about the farther future in the year 2161, roughly 130 some years in the future.
And it
that
won all
was
sorts of awards, 14 awards. So
Yes.
congratulations on that.
Yeah, thank you. It was including the Eric Hoffer Award, so best philosophical, best spiritual fiction, best adult fiction, best science fiction. It covered all those topics because that is a book that was inspired by my research in philosophy of mind. I went back to school after a 25-year career in tech. And among other things, I earned a master's in philosophy, focused on theory of mind, philosophy of mind. And I was deeply thinking about consciousness and what is human consciousness.
You're an ambitious guy, but Gary, most people, I don't think, would have the nerve to describe themselves as a philosopher. I mean, when you think of philosophers, you think of Wittgenstein or Plato or Socrates or maybe Hannah Arendt, but you certainly is that your choice, or are those your marketing folks who have chosen to call you
a little bit of both? Yeah. But so yeah,
who
philosopher.
Who are your philosopher heroes? What tradition were you most influenced in when you went back to school?
I think, Bas van Fraassen, who is a celebrated philosophy of science professor previously at Princeton, also was at San Francisco State. So it's more of an empirical tradition, thinking about philosophy. Jerry Fodor, who was at Rutgers, I deeply admired. And then Jaegwon Kim, who posed a really difficult problem in causation that really got me thinking. And it was such an absurdist conclusion that they reached in this question of causation that I realized it absolutely had to be wrong, but it did not seem to be any way to show that could be
Gary, coming
wrong.
back to the great challenges over the next 100 years, what you were worrying about in a coherently slow way, it seems to me, for what it's worth, that one of the great questions is, particularly in terms of philosophy, is for us humans, well, we got to figure out two things. Firstly, what's going to distinguish us from smart machines? And secondly, what our value is. Are those two issues that you address in Journey to 2125?
Those are the particular issues that I addressed in Unfettered Journey, because it's farther in the future when I do think we will have a case where we will have AI and robotics that will take all of our jobs. And when we do not have jobs, then how do we find meaning and purpose in our lives? And so in that farther future, when I think that is highly likely to happen, that's a major question.
Did you, coming back, I want to mostly talk about 2125, but did you,
sure.
I know the book got lots of awards, but did you miss something? It came out in 2020. I'm not sure when ChatGPT 3 came out, but we, as you know better than I do, you're living in San Francisco, you're a former tech exec. AI now is all the rage on every front. Had you known, if you were writing Unfettered Journey today in 2025, do you think you would have extended that AI future so far into the future, more than 150 years?
I think the answer is no. I would not have written Unfettered Journey any differently. And here's why. I will say this about Journey to 2125, which is the prequel that covers, roughly the next 100 years, that precedes in time what happens in the other book. And I wouldn't change the second book, because I think that, let me say this about the current rage about AI. That came out in 2022 with the Chat GPT moment. And I think that this wave of AI will cause a lot of change to the global economics. It will cause a lot of jobs to go away. But I don't believe that this wave from AI will dramatically reduce the total number of jobs. I think we will find new jobs to replace the old ones. It will totally change what jobs are out there. But I don't think this is the one that will be fundamentally
interesting. Maybe
disruptive.
that can be the subject of your third book. So I apologize if I keep on interrupting you. I'm pushing you ahead.
Okay.
Let's get. I want to get to 2025. I'm eager to get there, Gary.
Okay.
At least you're going to get me there. I probably won't get. I certainly won't get there in my own body.
Okay.
So if Unfettered Journey was about our role as humans is in comparison to smart machines and what we're going to do, what exactly is 2125 about, this journey? What are the big issues that you're addressing?
Okay, so by 2125, here are some of the challenges. Let's start with the first one that we were talking about. I think there'll be this first wave of AI that will not end up with a tremendous loss of jobs. But I think that there'll be a second wave when AI is truly embedded in robots, and that these machines are ubiquitous, walking around among us. And when that happens, that wave will destroy the massive amount of human jobs. And actually, I'm a little concerned that we go through this wave and it doesn't happen. And then humankind sits back and says, well, it didn't happen again this time. It didn't happen under the Industrial Revolution. It didn't happen when we, switched from horses to automobiles. We've had these waves. It doesn't look like it's going to destroy waves, but all of the jobs. But I'm afraid that would be a wrong conclusion, that when AIs are embedded in robots and robots are ubiquitous, then we have this tsunami of job loss. So that is one of the great challenges over this next 100 years. And so
I'm just curious, Gary, you mentioned before that you were a little frustrated with the quality of science fiction writing, which is why you got into the field. Did you ever have the chance to read a book which I thought was excellent, a book called Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, which I think really begins to address this future. Did you read that?
Yeah, I did. And I love that book. He's such a wonderful writer. And that gives you that book gives an insight into an idea of an AI starting to understand consciousness, becoming conscious. But my study in philosophy of mind suggests that turning into real consciousness is something that I think is interesting for science fiction in that book. I don't think it will happen. I have a scene in Unfettered Journey where a certain character says, the question is qualia. I don't know, Andrew, if you know that term in philosophy, qualia.
No, I don't.
So qualia is, in philosophical term, what does it feel like to X? What does it feel like to see a red apple? What does it feel like to taste an apple? Those are, in philosophy of mind, ideas that are central to what is necessary for consciousness. And so I use a scene where a certain robot says, oh no, I completely understand apples. I can tell you all of the 37 constituent parts of it. But the hero in that book basically says, you don't understand apples. Okay, you don't understand truth. You don't understand any of these fundamental things that are requisite for consciousness. And that's actually my conclusion studying philosophy of mind. I think that in philosophy of mind, there's what's called the hard problem of consciousness. That's a phrase from David Chalmers. And I think we are so far away from consciousness in those machines that And so I think that's an error that's popular science fiction promulgates out there, that it's just around the corner. And Silicon Valley promulgates that with their boosting AGI, artificial general
Yeah, we
intelligence.
had Gary Marcus on the show last week, who, of course, is one of the great skeptics of AGI. I wonder, you have a nice photo of yourself on your front page of your website. It looks as if you're standing in front of a vineyard or an orchard. You're clearly someone who knows what an apple is, but most humans don't either. I mean, I take your point that machines can't quite understand what an apple is in maybe a metaphysical sense, but humans, the vast majority of humans can't either. Is that fair, David? Gary, sorry, I called you David.
I don't think so. I think that, we have these experiences. We're embodied creatures. Embodiment is believed among the philosophers of mind to be a fundamental component of driving our consciousness. And that's a barrier for the AIs to reach consciousness. And no, I think that, that's part of the human experience. That's what makes us unique. Not to say that, you could imagine gradations getting closer to consciousness. So I won't say that
would
that'll
you,
never
as
happen.
a philosopher of mind, and as someone, you may not be a computer programmer, but you certainly got access to computer programmers, wouldn't you be able to explain what an apple is to a smart machine?
Well, my undergraduate degree was computer science and decision theory, operations research, and I was a coder early on in my career. So yeah, I know, I understand exactly how those machines are programmed, and they are just ones and zeros at the most basic level.
So that too, and I think this was Ishiguro's point, although it was a darker point, because it was harder and harder to tell the difference between humans and machines in Clara and the Sun. So let's go back on the road to 2125. So
great.
What are the other issues, Gary?
Okay, so in that, I asked myself, what are the fundamental challenges to humankind in this century? And part of my concern was that folks weren't focusing on them. So they are avoiding wide-scale nuclear war. And two is climate change, right? We know that one. But why are those two sort of linked together? Because there's lots of folks beating a drum between the U.S. and China, as an example, and looking at some inevitable conflict. There's lots of concern about China deciding to take Taiwan, and will that lead to a confrontation that could get out of control? If any of the major powers that have nukes, and if they decide to, suddenly something goes wrong and they have a wide-scale exchange, lose 10 or 20 cities each, humankind is now going to be facing an enormous disruption. And that disruption from that will take so much wealth to rebuild, that my concern is that then will not allow enough money to fight climate change before it's too late. So in that regard, wide-scale nuclear war is an existential threat to humanity, as is climate change if we don't do anything about it.
Yeah, and many books have been written about that. Martin Rees was on the show a couple of weeks ago, my old friend. He's written a series of books about maybe we as a species won't outlive the 21st century. And I think he puts nuclear war on the one of the most existential of the dangers. So what are you doing in, and you're certainly not the first or the last person to warn about either climate catastrophe or a nuclear apocalypse. What are you doing in Journey to 2021 to 2125 that hasn't been done before?
Well, I go back to in the classic days of science fiction, when they actually try to use a hard science view of the future. So I try to think about what technologies will do what roughly when, and which technologies we shouldn't worry about because they're kind of silly and they're a distraction. And as an example, with the issue of climate change, there was another book that very annoyed me, which I'll I'll avoid mentioning at the moment. But
please mention. It's always good to insult other people.
well, Ministry for the Future.
Yeah, I read that book. I have to admit, I'd heard so many good things about it. I was rather I mean, it didn't annoy me, but I was a little disappointed.
Yeah. Well, I was. I think he's a great writer about the science, about the Sierras and other things. But I was annoyed because I think that his science is suggesting what we should do focuses on the wrong kinds of things. And clearly we're going to have we need enough energy because people are not going to unplug their
Right.
cell
And just to
phones.
be clear, this is Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, which was very influential. I think President Obama strongly recommended it. It was a massive bestseller. So I'd like to actually get him on the show, but it was rather apocalyptic. Do you think it's more or less apocalyptic than Ishiguro's book? It's not as well written as Ishiguro.
Well, Ishiguro's book just sort of hints at this beginning of consciousness in the robot character. So that's a different aspect. The Ministry for the Future warns what will happen if we don't do things in enough time. Main part of the book is sort of a bureaucratic approach to trying to solve the problem. And I think he doesn't mention some of the most obvious things that we need to do to produce more, sustainable energy, right? And so that's what I try to do in my book, is say, let's just get the problem solved. And it's a bigger problem because we can't just have the developed countries in the world, get to carbon neutrality.
What's your position on your? We've done a number of shows on solar power recently. Gary did one with Bill McKibben, has a new book out called Here Comes the Sun. Bill, as I'm sure you know, is a very influential environmentalist, traditionally quite pessimistic, but has become more optimistic when it comes to solar power. He thinks we have one last chance. We've also done some shows on nuclear power. There was a Brazilian woman who's written a book about how nuclear power can save us. What's your position on solar versus nuclear? Do you mention this in 2125?
I do, actually. So solar has come down over 90% in terms of cost. That's wonderful. By the way, was the Brazilian woman Isabella?
Isabella Bermeque.
Oh, yeah, I met her at the Near Future conference. Yeah, she's great.
What did you? Yeah.
I think I would subscribe to her views. I think that, fission, that part of the atom is here. We can do it. It can produce a lot of energy. And I think is clearly part of it because, the sun doesn't shine at night. Wind only blows in certain areas. Trying to move all the energy from where it's produced to where it's needed requires lots of investment in the grid, which we're not doing. And even that doesn't solve the problems in the developing world. And so not only do I think that we need to develop especially small modular reactors, but I think we have to develop that technology and give it to the developing world. Because as Al Gore said a few months ago when he was here in San Francisco, the atmosphere is like an open sewer being treated that way by the fossil companies.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Isabel, because I know you're concerned about the threat of nuclear war and nuclear apocalypse. She argues, in my conversation with her, she said most of the opposition to nuclear power still comes from the anti-nuclear lobby, who don't understand that the existential threat of nuclear weapons and any threat of nuclear power are entirely different subjects.
I have a character in Journey to 2125. It says, comparing nuclear weapons to nuclear power is like comparing hydropower to hurricanes. Yeah,
or it's apples to oranges.
Yeah, it's just not in the same categories. So, yeah, and so I think that I actually think that nuclear has to be part of the solution. That if you are a good eco-environmentalist, that you will face facts and realize that, and so we will stop this unscientific opposition. And in fact, the main character in Journey to 2125, Max MacGyver, is a fission engineer, and by the end of the century, he's recognized as one of the global heroes saving the planet from this, because there is a very short window where we have to dramatically improve. So, and back to your question about solar, yes, I think that works. Wind works, but we need power that works to keep the grid operating around the clock. And we need to have energy sources like that that can be supplied to the developing world, so that they won't use the fossil fuels that are in the ground that are cheaper. So a character in my book is in Malawi in East Africa, and next door in Tanzania there are 1 billion tons of coal in the ground. So how do we keep those countries from using the obvious cheap source
I
for
was just
powering
in
their grids?
Tanzania last month, actually, in Zanzibar. So incredibly poor country. It's interesting that Ishiguro as well, he's sort of satirical, I think, about the sun. Of course, the book is called Clara and the Sun, and he's hinting at an age where we worship the sun, and certainly there's an element of sun worship in McKibben's book. In your imaginary 2125, do we believe in something? Are we praying to a nuclear god, a solar god? Where's the faith, Gary, in the future?
Yeah, no, not at all. In fact, if you look at the Pew studies, there has been a diminishment of religious fervor around the world that continues, and I have that trend continuing. I have a scene, for example, that takes place in Saudi Arabia, which is a very interesting country.
Of all places, yeah. We just did a show actually on MBS, another interesting character.
Yes, and I was in Saudi Arabia about a year ago and had a wonderful tour there to learn what is happening today. And I think so. This scene takes place in about 2090. You know, what happens when those countries run out of their fossil fuels? Which, you know, order of magnitude, that is about the best guess of when that might happen in Saudi Arabia. And so, have they changed their economy such that they can have other alternatives in place by them? That's a big question. And so there is a character there that talks about some lack of faith, as in his youth in that country. So
one of the things, Gary, that Silicon Valley doesn't always do very well, especially ex-technologists like you is address the issue of freedom and democracy. Of course, MBS is a wannabe enlightened despot, for better or worse. It'd be interesting to see whether he succeeds. How do you frame 2125 in terms of the future of democracy? Do you care about it? Do you think freedom is about saying what you want, or is freedom about making sure that we all have enough energy to warm or cool our homes?
Well, you've hit on another of the list of the biggest challenges for this century. One of them is protecting democracy, and the other one, I'll talk about that in a minute. Two characters, Wyatt and Lily, are a couple, past the year 2050, and they are worrying about that because think of the economics. When robots become more ubiquitous, when robots can build the robot factories that build the robots, we have a tremendous change in our economic system. Today, if you think about our economy, it's based on productivity, which is measured on labor. It's how much can each per capita can be produced by the economy. But when you have a situation when robots build the robot factories that build the robots, you suddenly have a gazillion robots. So Andrew, you could have 20 robots taking care of you. But in that case, the question is, who owns the robot factories?
Who takes care of the robots, in other words?
Well, the robots can take care of the robots, but who owns the robot factories that controls all of the wealth in the economy?
Yeah, it's Sam Altman, isn't it? He owns everything.
or a guy named Elon, who I think was pushing the value of Tesla, because he gave, at least as my reading, he was giving some suggestions that Tesla becomes that company. Yeah.
So, are you concerned with the Tesla? That was a slip there. With the Elons and the Sam Altmans of the future, is that the way? At least in the future, we need to protect ourselves from democracy and making sure that the Elons and the Altmans of the world don't own the future, quite literally?
Yes, and so back to the book, Journey to 2125. One of the characters, Harper, she's building robot companies, right? So, and I wouldn't say she is exactly one of your of the good guys in the book. So yes, part of the idea of Journey to 2125 is to make these challenges and this march of technology feel real and authentic through the eyes and experiences of real people. So that's why this book takes place in 2125. It's opens with the story of a grandfather who was born this year, 2025. So he's 100 years old, and his long separated grandson shows up on his doorstep and wants to know something about his family and why his parents ran off to the commune. And so Max MacGyver, the grandfather, tells the family secrets. And in doing so, he's telling a family saga over 4 generations. And Max says the MacGyver family is, quote, more than a footnote. And so I use this vehicle to explore in a very real way what it will feel like to go forward. So that's the book. And
what about, let's go back to your concern about nuclear weapons. You've addressed climate change. You're in the nuclear power camp. How are we supposed to address the threat of nuclear war? We've done a number of shows recently about the decline crisis of the United Nations. One of the reasons why it seems as if we can't address current wars in the Ukraine or in Gaza is because we don't have the international organizations to be able to do that. Do you touch on that in this book? Is there a replacement for the UN? Is technology replacing it? How do we go back, in a sense, to 1945 and the optimism of internationalism?
Well, and we should go back to the slow, hard work of diplomacy to make agreements that slowly bring these weapons under better control. So there was a movie called Countdown to Zero that happened a decade ago. Jeff Skolin, Participant Productions, founded and sponsored it. And I'm on the board of something called the Santa Fe Institute that does complexity research. A person named Valerie Plame, who you may have heard of, and I decided to organize.
What scandal was she involved in?
Pardon me?
She was involved in one of those. Was it the weapons of mass destruction? One of those stories in the Bush administration.
She was a CIA agent who was outed by Dick Cheney. Right. When her husband suggested that there was no yellow cake in Africa, that was the
supposed weapons of mass destruction.
So. Exactly, and so she was outed from the CIA, and then she was for a while involved with doing some marketing at the Santa Fe Institute, and so the two of us helped us set up a sneak peek view of the movie as it was coming out, and we organized a conference at the Santa Fe Institute that had several hundred people in the audience, including a couple Nobel Prize winners, and the person who had spent 30 years of his career building H-bombs at Los Alamos, along with the person from the Reagan administration who negotiated the SALT II treaty. So we had a great conversation.
It sounds interesting, but what's that got to do with 2125 and the threat of nuclear war?
So that the idea of countdown to zero, we have to figure out how to get to zero nukes, and that was proceeding along with the SALT agreements, and we went from 70,000 nuclear weapons in the United States in the world in the 60s and 70s, 80s to the U.S. has something on the order of 1,500. So do the Russians. The Chinese have 400-ish. And they plan to have 1,000 by 2030. And there are other countries. So we're unfortunately we are going in the wrong direction for the last 15 years. There's been more of a move to try to let that out of the box, and we need to work harder to negotiate it down towards zero. And so
Well,
there
when you
is a
say we need to
scene in
work
this book.
harder, we, who is it, you and I? I mean, is it Putin and Trump and Xi? Who is supposed to work harder?
Yeah, it's going to have to be a diplomatic move, and hopefully we have the right leaders who think that's
Well, I
important
think we
again.
don't. I mean, I don't think anyone would argue that Putin, Xi, or Trump are the right kind of leaders. Are they?
So
In
let's
your
take that
view, I
forward.
mean, at least I'm curious. Do you think they're the right kind of leaders? Would
Well,
we want
no,
those
now.
leaders in 21, 25?
No. And in fact, if we don't do anything, what's obvious is that we'll repeat Hiroshima. That was it was nice of you to pull up a blog post that I did on the 80th anniversary of the dropping of the bombs at Hiroshima. And that's my concern. And in fact, there's a scene in Journey to 2125 where the result of not solving that problem comes to a nasty fruition. I will not say more than that, except that it is not the wide-scale nuclear war that sets all of humanity back for a century or more, but it's still a nasty reminder that
Oh, it
this is
sounds
possible.
like your book is. I mean, what are you trying to do in this book, Journey to 2125, Gary? Are you trying to warn people? You're trying to get them off their couches and say, you got to go down to the town square and demonstrate? Or what's the point of the book?
Exactly that. Exactly that. It says that here are the major things to worry about. Don't worry about the other 50 things that are out there that are being talked about. Here is a short list actually. And if we solve these problems, then maybe humanity can muddle through this century and come out the other end, okay. And in fact, maybe better because.
So, but isn't that, and this
Yeah.
comes back to politics, and I don't mean to generalize. Not everyone in Silicon Valley is hostile to politics or doesn't understand politics, but ultimately these are political questions. The issue of energy and of nuclear weapons. So ultimately, are you arguing, or is the narrative in the book about the MacGyvers? Are they political animals? Are you suggesting that we need more or less politics? Should we be engaged more actively?
They are, among other things, political actors. That's right. They're involved in that conversation. And I tried to make the book realistic about the kinds of things that we should both try to do and those things we should warn against. We have corrupt politicians in the book, and what can that lead to? So, as an example.
Final question, Gary. You live in a very nice part of San Francisco. You made a lot of money in one of the big internet companies. I think you were the CFO or CTO at eBay back in the day. A lot of people are concerned that and alongside your issue of environmental catastrophe and the threat of nuclear war, that the most fundamental threat challenging certainly people in the US, maybe not more broadly humanity, is economic inequality. Is that something you address in the book?
Absolutely. So back to the comment that I made, that what happens when robots build the robot factories that build the robots? We will have more stuff, we'll have more absolute wealth, but the question is then who owns the robot factories? And so one of the challenges on the list is, how do we transition from the current capitalist system that we have to something that must replace it when that happens? How do we manage that transition? And you can imagine good ways that can happen and bad ways that can happen. And so I try to make that decision, that challenge, real in the book, so that we can have that as a
Well,
point of
let's
conversation.
end on that. Good. I mean, we're imagining then you suggest a post-capitalist future. What's one good way of replacing capitalism and one bad way? Maybe start with the bad way so we can end on a positive note.
Okay, well, let's start with the bad way. The bad way, in my first book, Unfettered Journey, there is something called the levels. The levels are a system put in place where everyone has a level from level 1 at the top to 99 at the bottom. Supposedly, the system is put together based on merit, but certain folks question whether it's really merit or there's a legacy. If you go back a few years, you can think about our conversations about equality, right? And I might ask, do we have a level system today in society, really? That's maybe a unspoken question in that book. So yes, a negative is you have something. And by the way this comes about is the folks who own the robot factories give up control. The robot factories are all owned by society in general, but the quid pro quo for that is a system that essentially puts in place a more precise levels.
So
So
what you're
that's a bad
saying
outcome.
is that is there a Randian quality there? Are you
You are
distasteful of socialism?
you know there's a Randian quality in that the Randian characters are the bad guys.
Okay, so Rand's bad. So what's good?
So what's good is there'll be enough stuff, right? I mean, I think if you do the
So you're an
math forward,
abundance theorist, Gary, are you? There'll
well,
be
I
enough?
think no, if you do the math forward, I think we'll have on the order of 5 to 10 times as much stuff in another 100 and some years per capita, because when robots are making stuff, we have all those robots. So then the question becomes an allocation question, and I think there's lots of ways that we can have a much more equal allocation of all of that wealth. And so is that utopian view completely possible? It's a little bit possible. It's mostly constrained by human tendencies. And so, that's the big question. How will
Well, here
that be
comes the sun
resolved?
in a way. We did McKibben's book, and then a different kind of sun is coming. I think in Gary Benger's book, Journey to 21, 25. Very interesting conversation, Gary. Congratulations on all the awards you've won for your two books. I know there's a third book. I'm sure there's a third book coming, so we'll have to get you back on when that comes out. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. It's been a delight to be talking to you today.